Well, this morning we're going to think about how important community is. How important it is that we actually connect with one another. And this morning, I want to start with a little interactive quiz. So, when animals of the same kind are grouped together in community, really smart scientist people have names for them. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have a little interactive quiz about the names of groups of animals. And so I wanted to see how many of you are like avid Animal Planet watchers. All right, we're going to start with some easy ones because I don't want anyone to be tense and uptight. We're going to start with some stuff that I'm hoping you can get. Okay, what do you call a group of wolves? A pack. Good. Okay, good. We're rolling. What do you call a group of sheep? A flock. Yes, a flock. What do you call a group of elephants? A herd. Okay. What do you call a group of lions? A pride. Okay, we'll move to some tougher ones. This is like level 2. What do you call a group of geese? A gaggle. Good. I was waiting for someone to say flock. Nice job, gaggle. What do you call a group of crows? A murder. Nasty little things. What do you call a group of whales? A pod. Okay, now I really like this one. What do you call a group of rhinos? Anybody know? Scary. They're called a crash. How awesome is that? It's a crash of rhinos. Okay, one last one. Let's see if anybody can get this one. This is a pretty tough one too. What do you call a little community, a little group of porcupines? Anybody know? This is awesome, you guys. They're called a prickle. So, okay, let's talk a little bit about porcupines. The North American porcupine has around 30,000 quills, okay? And each quill can be driven deep into an enemy, and then the enemy's body heat will cause the microscopic barbs on the quill to expand so that the quill is then firmly embedded. Okay, and the wounds then can fester, and the more dangerous wounds, like the ones affecting vital organs, can actually be fatal. And so, as you can imagine, porcupines aren't real big on community. Like, they don't snuggle together a lot. But once a year, and this is interesting to think about, once a year, porcupines get a strong urge for community. Like late in the fall, a porcupine's attention turns to love. Okay, but now think about this, because love is risky business when you're a porcupine. It's not like they lay eggs or something. And it turns out that lady porcupines are open to dinner and a movie only once a year. In fact, female porcupines are sexually receptive only 8 to 12 hours per year. I'll say, so if you are a male porcupine, you better proceed with caution. Because a girl porcupine's no is the most widely respected no in all of the animal kingdom. So once a year, porcupines do a little porcupine dance. And it's a tricky dance. It's a dance that is fraught with risk. But they feel compelled to pursue it anyway. Okay, in love and community, porcupines face, obviously, a huge dilemma. Okay, how do you get close without getting hurt? And if we're really honest, I think we can admit that this is also a very human dilemma. Because the truth is that human beings are designed to live in community. We're designed to thrive only if we're engaged in meaningful relationships with God and with each other. Okay? But getting close to people is tricky, right? I mean, it's risky. Because the truth is, we're all flawed. We're all broken. We're all fallen. None of us is perfectly whole. None of us have it all together. Okay, we're all a little bit prickly. And we poke each other. And we sting each other sometimes. John Ortberg wrote a book several years ago, and I love this book, and I love the title of it. Wrote a book several years ago entitled, Everybody's Normal Until You Get to Know Them. Then he begins the book with this. He says, in certain stores, you will find a section of merchandise available at greatly reduced prices. The tip-off is a particular tag you will see on all the items in that area. Each tag carries the words, as is. This is a euphemistic way of saying these are damaged goods. Sometimes they're called slightly irregular. And the store is giving you fair warning. This is the department of something's gone wrong. Okay, you're about to find a flaw here. A stain that won't come out. A zipper that won't zip. A button that won't butt. There will be a problem. Okay, these items are not normal. Now, we're not going to tell you where the flaw is. You'll have to look for it. But we know it's there. So when you find it, and you will find it, don't come whining and sniveling to us. Because there's a fundamental rule when dealing with merchandise in this corner of the store. No returns. No refunds. No exchanges. If you were looking for perfection, you walked down the wrong aisle. You've received fair warning. If you want this item, there's only one way to obtain it, okay? You must take it as is. And he continues, and he says, when you deal with human beings, you have come to the as-is corner of the universe. Think for a moment about someone in your life. Maybe the person you know best. Maybe the person you love most. Maybe the person sitting next to you. That person is slightly irregular. And of course, he says, the most painful part of this is realizing that I am in the as-is department as well. Throughout history, human beings have resisted owning up to that little tag. We try to separate the world into normal, healthy people like us and difficult people. So, guys, can we just admit something together? We all got issues. We got issues. Okay, we're all a little bit prickly. Sometimes we're insecure. Sometimes we're too sensitive. Sometimes we're arrogant. Sometimes we're controlling. Sometimes we're manipulative. Sometimes we ignore people. Sometimes we say and we actually do mean stuff. We all have barbs that can be thrust into an enemy at any given moment. And the really sad thing is that oftentimes we don't just thrust them into enemies. If you do life with other people, eventually you hurt the people that you love. And they hurt you. Because real human relationships are always a porcupine dance. And yet, the yearning to attach and connect and belong, the yearning to love and be loved is the fiercest longing of the human soul. Our need for community with people and with God is to the human spirit like what food, air, and water are to the human body. And so, deep down, we all know, as frustrating as people can be, it's hard to find a good substitute. And so today, we're going to think about the reality that we live in, that life among other people is a porcupine dance. And we're going to think about managing anger and managing conflict. And we're going to look at some very, very famous words of Jesus on this issue. Okay, but before we dive into his words, I want us to get a little bit of context. Now, we were in this series looking at the Sermon on the Mount. Does anybody remember that? That was forever ago. Okay, we were looking at the most famous and most complete sermon of Jesus, and then we got snowed out. Okay, and then I was in Haiti, and so Chris did a little 2-week mini-series, and so we took a 3-week break. Okay, and so now we're back in this series, and we will be until Easter. So for about 3 minutes, let me go back and just recap some really important stuff. And I know for those of you that have been here, I know that you've heard this before, okay? But it was almost a month ago. I can't even remember what I talked about a month ago. So let's just kind of recap and get caught back up. Here's the backdrop for the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus has been healing people all over Palestine. He's restoring sight to the blind. He's giving hearing back to the deaf. He's healing people of leprosy and all kinds of diseases. He's been casting out demons, like delivering people. And he goes from place to place and he's healing people and he's delivering people. And then he would stop and he would teach them. And the theme of his message, we're told, was always the same. It was always about the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God coming. He kept saying to the crowds everywhere he went, repent, for the kingdom of heaven has now come near. He was announcing the good news, the gospel. He was saying that life together with God, in God's favor and in God's presence, that life has now become available, like right here on earth, to ordinary people. He says, because of my life and my presence with you, he's saying to them, it's now among you. And it's now available to you. And so people naturally wanted to know, well, who can be a part of this? Like, who's eligible to participate in this? What sorts of people are eligible to take part in all of this? And so one day, in the midst of a full day of healing and delivering people, Jesus goes up on a hillside and he sits down to teach. And he says something very shocking to this huge crowd of misfits about who it is that can actually be blessed. He says stuff like, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the persecuted. And he goes on and on. Okay, in other words, it's not just the rich, and it's not just the successful, and it's not just the healthy and the beautiful. It's not just the spiritually superior. Jesus is saying, blessed now are the people that everybody assumed were cursed by God. Blessed are the people that everybody assumed had been written off by God. The diseased, the demon-possessed, the persecuted. And the point is that the kingdom is here, Jesus is saying, and it's available to everybody. Anybody at all. Anybody can just start to live this kingdom kind of life. Anybody at all can begin to acknowledge God, and they can be forgiven, and they can start a new life. A life characterized by dependence on God, a life that shares God's values, a life that becomes devoted to God's purposes. Now, as you think about that, you go, well, that's all great, but that's kind of vague, right? I mean, what would that actually look like lived out in real life? I mean, how would somebody live that out in their very normal, very average day-to-day life? Well, that's what the rest of this sermon of Jesus was all about. The rest of the sermon is simply examples or pictures or illustrations of how a person with a heart that's aligned with God might actually live. How they might deal with various day-to-day stuff. How they might deal with marriage. How they might deal with money. How they might deal with worry. How they might deal with their enemies. How they might deal with injustice. How they might approach things like prayer and fasting and other spiritual stuff. And so Jesus kind of goes rapid fire in this sermon of his through all of these very real life topics. And the very first thing that he addresses, the very first issue that he deals with when it comes to illustrating this new kind of life, the very first illustration that he gives concerns anger and conflict. And here's what he said. Here's how he starts. Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 to 22. He says, you have heard it said that it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. So Jesus has been talking about the kingdom. He's talking about God's presence on earth. That it's everywhere around us, that it's now available to us, that if we begin to perceive it and align ourselves with it, that unimaginably beautiful things are now possible. And so he now starts to explain how this might affect anger, how it might affect conflict. And he's saying, look, you are being invited into a different kind of life, a life that's defined by love. And so if you think love is just about like murder avoidance, you're sadly mistaken. Like murder avoidance. He's like, think things through, guys. Murder avoidance is kind of a low bar for love, for a life of love. Now, sometimes people hear these words and they get kind of hung up on how harsh Jesus is about anger here. He says, "But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment." And sometimes people hear that and they think, oh my goodness. Jesus says that if I ever get mad at anyone, he's going to send me to hell. Let me just say, that is not what he's saying. Okay? So if you were thinking that, it's like, whew, okay. He's saying that experiencing the kingdom of God is possible right now. That the kingdom isn't just some far-off place that you go when you die. That there's more of the kingdom to come, okay, in the future. It's going to come more in its fullness, like in the future. And crossing over after death is certainly a part of this whole experience. But the kingdom, Jesus is saying, and this is what he was insisting upon, the kingdom is actually available to experience for ordinary people right here, right now. And it happens when we align our wills with God's will. When we learn to walk intimately with him, when his values become our values, when we start to want what it is that he wants. And it happens when we begin to act in concert with God to change the world. When we look at aspects of the world that aren't right, like people living in places where they have no access to clean water. Things aren't how God wants them to be, and we begin to work together with him to bring his will about on the face of the earth, to bring heaven to earth. That's kingdom life. Okay, but see, when we experience anger and then we let it fester and then we feed it and we let anger sprout into contempt and contempt into hatred, we can be sure that we no longer have God's heart. We're no longer living the kingdom kind of life. And so not only, Jesus says, not only, guys, does God oppose murder, but actually God opposes hatred. He opposes it because hatred destroys human community. And so Jesus continues. Listen to all of verse 22 now. He says, "But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, 'Raka,' is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in the danger of the fire of hell." Now, I don't know about you, but I have never said "Raka" to anyone. So I guess I'm like clear on this one. But I like the sound of it. Don't you like the sound of it? Like someone cuts you off in traffic on I-5 and you're like, "Raka." Now the Aramaic word, okay, "Raka," is a word that actually is very, very difficult to translate into English. And so most English translations just sort of cheat and they just put quotes around it and they keep "Raka" in the translation because they're like, we don't know what to do with this word. But here's the idea. It was basically a big-time insult, okay? It was like saying to somebody, "You bleeping idiot." Bible scholar Dallas Willard says this, and this is graphic. This is a Bible scholar, and I love the way he uses like Bible scholar language to describe this and paint this picture. Check this out, and I quote, talking about the word "Raka." "It may have originated from the sound one makes to collect spittle from the throat in order to spit." Now, Dallas Willard is American. I think he's from the South, actually. But that sounds British, doesn't it? It sounds British. "It may have originated from the sound one makes to collect spittle from the throat in order to spit." Okay, now, translated into normal English. He's saying the word "Raka" possibly originated from the sound that you were going to make as if you were going to hock a loogie. And then spit it in someone's face. Okay? Jesus is saying, that's not good. So when you get angry and you get that hateful, it's dangerous for your heart. That's not kingdom life. And that's the kind of heart and attitude that will eventually destroy community. So Jesus says, and now think about this, he says, "And anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in the danger of the fire of hell." Okay? Again, if you're sitting here and you're thinking, oh man, uh-oh, I think I called somebody a fool once, like, am I going to hell? The answer is, that's not the point. Okay, the point is, when we stop looking at people with grace and compassion, when we start labeling people and putting them in a box, when we start using maybe racial slurs or sexist slurs, when we start thinking of people as idiots or as morons or as, I know you guys can think of much, much worse words than that. I can't say them from up here, but when we do that, it prevents us from loving them. Okay, now in our culture, we look at this and go, because to call someone a fool in our culture is not really a big deal. It's like calling them a nerd or something, And in our culture, like, the word nerd can be kind of endearing, actually. Like, a girl can flirt with a guy and be like, oh, stop it, you big nerd. Okay, and see, for us, the word fool sort of carries the same weight as that sort of flirty nerd thing. Like if you're really upset in our culture, okay, if you're really upset with somebody, you're really angry, you probably don't call them a fool. Okay, but see, in Jewish culture, calling someone a fool was big time. I mean, that was a major insult. It was more like calling someone a bleeping, starting with an F, jerk, than it was, that's what it's comparable to. And so fools in their culture were people that had like completely lost their way. They were total idiots. They were people that had lost their sense of what's right. They had lost their sense of God. They lost their sense of common human wisdom. They were so out of touch with what's healthy that they were essentially a detriment to others and to themselves. And so just an example of this. You think about that famous Jewish proverb from the Bible. Okay, this is Proverbs 26:11. I would say I love this, but I don't. It says, as a dog returns to its own vomit, so a fool repeats his folly. What do fools do? They keep eating their own vomit. Okay, so what is a fool? A fool is a vomit eater. And some of you are like, man, you're getting like crass and like disgusting today. I'm just teaching the Bible, man. And the Bible is pretty graphic. Okay, now see, here's the point is that calling somebody a fool was not a way to flirt with them. It was a horrible label that put somebody in a terrible box. And Jesus says, when you start doing that, your heart is in danger and the very possibility of community is completely threatened. When we start writing each other off, we start labeling each other, that's when community gets destroyed. That's when people stop loving each other. That's when grace stops being extended. That's when healing and reconciliation become impossible. And when that happens to community, and Jesus is trying to drive this home to the people that follow him closely, when that happens to community, it breaks God's heart. That's never God's will for people. Now, I've been thinking about this a lot the last few months. Many of you know that in December, my mom passed away very suddenly. And almost exactly a year before that, some of you knew this as well, my stepdad passed away. And the two of them had divorced when I was 10. They married when I was just an infant. He was the only dad that I had known growing up. But they divorced when I was 10, and they really stopped having contact with each other. Like, when they passed away, they hadn't had any contact with each other for decades. But they both passed away within a year. And so with both of them passing, I've thought a lot about our family. And I remember when they were married, and we were this little family. And they used to do this thing. I don't know if my mom invented it or what. They used to do this thing, and it was like super cheesy, but I really liked it. When I was like 6 or 7, my mom would say, hey, let's make a bologna sandwich. And my mom and dad would like be the bread, and I would be the bologna. And so it was basically like this big 3-way hug, with me in the middle. And now I know that that's like super cheesy, but when I was little, I liked it. And I remember back to a time when the three of us were like really happy. And it was that way for a long, long time. And then at some point, they started to fight a lot. And my mom was kind of a screamer. And so she would just, my dad was real quiet, but my mom was just a screamer. And she'd start yelling, and I would just be like, I can't stand this. And so I'd go outside, and I'd try to shoot hoops out there. And I thought, dribbling the ball and pounding it off the basket would just sort of cover up the yelling and the screaming. And then one day, my mom called a little family meeting. And she announced that she and I were going to be moving away, that she was leaving my stepdad. And I'll tell you what, that day for me changed everything. There was no more little family. And it was crazy hard for me. But now, like as an adult looking back on that, I mostly feel really bad for them. Look, my stepdad never remarried. Never remarried. He never knew a love that deep again. He ended up moving to Pennsylvania a few years ago to live near some other family that could take care of him. And I couldn't be with him, and he didn't have a wife. And he passed away last December. My mom ended up marrying a couple of more times, and both were very brief, and both were very lifeless marriages. And then in December, my mom died, and she died alone. In fact, the only way that anyone even knew that there was a problem is that she missed an appointment. And so her psychiatrist called the fire department to do a well check on her, and the fire department and the police called me and told me that she had died alone in her apartment, and they weren't sure how long she'd been in there. And so recently, I've been thinking about our little family that became no more. And I'm thinking about the two of them and the reality of them dying without each other. And I've been thinking about how maybe it could have been. Like, what if they had learned to work through things? What if there somehow could have been grace? What if there somehow could have been reconciliation? Because I'll tell you what, I believe that God deeply grieved the loss of that little community when it happened. And I think that God deeply grieved the way that both of them finished their lives. I don't think it was God's will for them to end like that. But when conflict and anger are mismanaged, humanity and human community always suffers. Long-time friendships end. Potential friendships never form. Families become isolated. Co-workers can't work together anymore. Business partnerships end. Parents get separated from their children. Brothers and sisters actually stop talking to each other. And every single time, and this is what Jesus wants us to understand, every single time, God's heart aches. And so Jesus gives a very stern warning. You better be very, very careful with anger. And then he gives us two very earthy, very practical examples. Gives us two very practical illustrations of conflict management. Two different ideas for how kingdom people might do things. And so here's the first one. This is verses 23 and 24. He says, "Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that a brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, and then come and offer your gift." Now again, and we've talked about this, in this series prior till now, we've talked about this a lot. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus was not giving us more legalism. He's not giving us hard and fast rules to follow, like under any situation, at any point, no matter what the circumstances are. He's not saying something like, okay, look, you can never go to church and worship God until you've gone out into the world and repaired every broken relationship that you've ever had in your life. Okay, if that was the case, none of us would be here. The point here is that spiritual life lived through rituals is not to be done like instead of spiritual life in relationships. Like to engage in spiritual activities is good and it's life-giving and it's essential and it's something that God wants us to do. But if it's done to the neglect of human relationships, something has gone horribly wrong. Like to keep doing all of your religious routines, but then at the same time to just ignore relational breakdown in your life, that just doesn't make any sense for a kingdom kind of person. And so Jesus makes a great point here. He says, when something goes haywire, somebody needs to step up and start a conversation. Somebody needs to say, you know what, something feels off, and I want us to get things back on track. Somebody needs to care enough to actually step out and take initiative. But here's what we all tend to do. We think, well, yeah, okay, but let them come to me. Like, if they think that I've wounded them, if they have a problem, then let them say something. And of course, when it's reversed, and we've been wounded, we think, well, they hurt me. They should come and apologize to me. Let them make the first move. But either way, we're justified in just stepping back and doing nothing, just isolating. But Jesus is saying, here's what kingdom people do with conflict. They take initiative to talk it out. They take initiative to work it out. And they do it with grace, and they do it with sensitivity, and they do it with humility. They take responsibility for whatever part of the problem they may have contributed. They ask a lot of questions of the other person about how they're feeling and what happened, and then they really listen. But they take initiative. They seek reconciliation. They seek healing. And I'll tell you what, man, I am so incredibly thankful for people that have done this with me. Jen and I have very good friends in this church that have been good friends of ours for a long time that are so good about this. And over the years, I have said things and I have done things that have hurt them or confused them. And they could have just walked away. People do it all the time in churches. They could have just left the relationship with me and with Jen and with this community. But they didn't. Several times they've come to me and they've brought it up and we've talked it out together. And I'm so incredibly thankful for that. I'm telling you, I'm incredibly thankful for that. And they're such good friends to us and to our family. And then I think about my relationship with Jen. And if you're visiting with us, she's the announcements lady. So if you're a dude and you're single and you were checking her out, stop it. But some of you guys, you look at us and you think, well, I don't know what you think, but sometimes people look at pastors and assume that their wives are lucky. Like the pastor's wife has hit the jackpot. Like that guy must be an amazing husband, and that guy must be an amazing father. And I could keep going, but I'll just stop there. Okay, let me let you in on a little secret. My wife puts up with a lot. In fact, I can do really dumb stuff without even knowing it. And so thankfully, she brings it to my attention. And to be honest, one of the hallmarks of our marriage has been truth. When there are issues, we talk them out. And I'll tell you what, sometimes that's been really hard. In fact, much of the first year, maybe even 2 years of our marriage was hell on earth. I mean, it seemed like we had a major confrontation, major discussion every day. And I'll tell you what, it was exhausting. And I remember going to bed a lot, just feeling defeated. I mean, I'd go to bed and I would think, oh God, this is impossible. She's impossible, God. And Jen would be so upset about the whole thing that she wouldn't, she'd be somewhere else in the house because she couldn't sleep. And so I'd start to pray. And as I would pray, I'd sense God saying, get up, you idiot. Don't give up. Go talk to her. And I would. And after praying a little bit and after resting a little bit, I'd go back with a much better attitude. I'd go back much more open, and I would take a whole lot more responsibility for my part in the problem. And inevitably, she would eventually move my way, at least a little bit. And she would express what was going on with her, and I would understand her heart a little bit better. And because we were talking, she would understand my heart a little bit better. And over time, those conversations then became less and less and less frequent. And we started to kind of get into a groove. Okay, and now those conversations are actually pretty rare. They still happen sometimes. And I don't look forward to them. But we are committed to having them. And here's the big payoff, okay? After years of doing this, like years of learning how to love each other, she is absolutely my best friend in the world. And there is no one that I would rather spend time with than her. And some of you, I love you, but you're a distant second, baby. But that has not been automatic. That didn't just sort of happen. And the first year or two of this whole thing was incredibly tough. But one of us always took some initiative, and healing started to happen. Because it's amazing what can happen when someone takes initiative. And that leads to Jesus' second very tangible illustration. Okay, verses 25 and 26. He says, settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. Okay, so in this Jesus' second illustration, he said, okay, here's another scenario, another example. Let's say that the conflict has gotten legs. Let's say that it's turning into like a huge court dispute. Here's an idea. What if you went and tried to talk it out instead of going to court? Because if you can't work this thing out, it might get really, really ugly. To be honest with you, when I read this, that's common sense, isn't it? It's just common sense. I mean, if you sit back in anger and they sit back in anger, this might get really expensive and really, really ugly. So Jesus says, how about you go directly to them and see if you can talk it out and work it out? Who knows? Maybe something good will come of it. Now, because we tend to love legalism and American Christians are just legalism addicts, some Christians read Jesus this way. They think he's saying it's wrong to ever go to court or be involved in the legal process. And there are Christians that will let, people do horrible things to them and to others. Let them walk all over them in ways that are completely unjust, like people that will just give up their rights to their own children and so forth because they won't get engaged in a legal process. That's not what Jesus is saying. The point is not that it's wrong to go to court. The point is anger and conflict always tend to escalate. They always tend to escalate. And if you don't cut it off and you don't deal with it, who knows where it might end up? And so why not take some initiative early on and see if you can work something out? Okay? As we wrap up, I just want you to think about you. How are the relationships going with you? Because maybe you got something that's really, really off somewhere. Maybe, you've got an issue with your dad or your mom. Maybe there's something that's going on in your marriage. Maybe there's something significant happening with one of your kids or a coworker or somebody that used to be a pretty good friend to you. And your tendency to this point has been just kind of, let it go. And the reality is maybe you're thinking, you know what, they've hurt me. They've done some wrong things to me. So if they want this thing fixed, if they want it to be better, then let them come to me. Let them take a first step. Let them humble themselves and swallow their pride and do something about this. And Jesus is saying that's not how kingdom people do it. They take initiative. They go in humility. They swallow their pride. They look for ways that they can confess wrong on their own part, and they draw people back into community. This is what they do. And it's amazing what God will do and how God will bless things when you take a step of faith and you ask him to be present with you in a situation. And so I just want to encourage you. It might be time to quit being in isolation. It might be time to make a move. And in reality, this is exactly what Jesus does with us. The truth is, we all offend Jesus all the time. We make promises to him about how we're going to live or how we're going to pursue our spiritual life or how we're going to do things from here on. Anybody ever done that? And then we don't do it. And so Jesus says, well, I'm sending you to hell, right? Not so much. It's interesting. Jesus has this like relentless, dogged, passionate pursuit of everybody. No matter how fast and how hard we're running away from him, he comes calling to us. And maybe you've been in a spot recently where in your heart you're going, I need to get back to church. Or you have a Christian friend at work who said something to you and you're like, wow, that makes a lot of sense. And you started thinking about spiritual stuff. Or maybe that kind of process happened for you a long time ago. And now you've responded to it and you're in this relationship with God and things are flourishing in your life and there's healing in your heart and there's wholeness and you're viewing the world differently. Do you know why that happened? It happened because God refuses to give up on you. It happens because God is relentless in his pursuit of you. And what Jesus is saying is, that's what kingdom life looks like. I'm inviting you into it. And here's the secret. Along the way, you're going to find peace and you're going to find joy, and it's so much better than sitting around in anger. Jesus is inviting us into a different kind of life, a kind of life that looks like his. And the reality is, when someone accepts that invitation to step into that life, everybody around them wins. If you decide to step into that life, your kids win, your spouse wins, your parents win. The people at school win, your coworkers win, your neighbors win. Everybody around you wins when you decide to do that because you become an agent that's now bringing the kingdom of heaven to earth. Somehow God uses you to do that. It's extraordinary. But that's the invitation. God, I thank you so much for your willingness to love us, to pursue us, and to show us how to love. And I pray this morning that as we think about this, if we've got real people and real images flooding through our minds, I pray that you would help us to not only be mindful of those people, but really be seeking you about how best to respond. And there's no formulaic way to deal with all of this stuff. It's different for every person in every situation. But I pray that you would give us wisdom. I pray that you'd fill us with courage. I pray that you would help us to take initiative where we need to. I pray that you would humble us and help us to own the ways we've contributed to problems in relationships we're having with people. And most of all, God, I pray that you would bring healing. If there's a marriage that's really in trouble and people are sitting here this morning, I pray that you would protect them from ending up the way that my mom and my stepdad did. And if there are people here who look at a picture in their home of a 4 or 5-year-old child that they used to be so connected with and now it's just a mess, I pray that you would give them hope that something can be done about that. Reconciliation can happen. And I pray that you would help them to be aggressive about pursuing it and relentless about pursuing it. People that have lost a friendship or that there's something goofy going on or at work or whatever it is, God, help us to be agents for goodness and for your kingdom. Amen.